The more connected fans feel to their sports teams, the more likely they are to invest in it, whether it's tickets, gear, or souvenirs. Engage with fans by asking for their input on team decisions by getting a .vote team website. Visit GoDaddy.com today to get started.
Before the internet existed. That's a weird sentence to say. Before the internet existed. It makes it seem like you rode a dinosaur to your first job. But before smartphones or push notifications, before Twitter or even ESPN, there was a number, a 7-digit number that diehard fans and hardcore gamblers knew by heart. 976-1313. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s or even early 90s, and you needed a score, you had to know what your team was doing, if your parlay was still alive, who hit a walk-off home run, who got traded. You didn't check your phone. You used the phone to call sports phone. That's right. You picked up the receiver and you dialed 976-1313 and listened to a fast-talking voice rattle off scores or injuries or betting lines or breaking news in a 60-second burst. It was revolutionary, it was addictive, and it was everywhere, especially in New York, where it became part of the culture, a lifeline for fans, for bookies, for bettors, long before instant access was really a thing. On today's episode of Gordon Damer on Sports, we dig into the wild story behind Sports Phone with Scott Orgera, one of the co-authors of the book 976-1313, How Sports Phone Launched Careers and Broke New Ground. From the fast-paced grind behind the scenes to the voices that would go on to become broadcasting legends. And yes, even a link to Henry Hill and the mobster whose story was told in Goodfellas. It's a time capsule of sports, technology, and it's all right now on Gordon Damer on Sports. Welcome into another episode of Gordon Damer on Sports. As always, thanks for listening. And as always, before we get too deep into it, please hit that subscribe button. So for today, I thought I would do something a little different, a little walk down memory lane, if you will. You know, it's kind of hard to explain to somebody who's under, say, 35, but there was a time where if you missed the 11 o'clock news or you didn't want to wait for the next morning's paper, as a sports fan, you were kind of stuck. How else were you going to get that information? And then came a phone service where you could call a number and get everything you were looking for. And it was Sports Phone, 976-1313, the phone number that even to this day is ingrained in sports fans' memory. This was your only shot at finding out what your favorite team did or if a trade went down. What happened in the West Coast games? Did you win your bet or not? Sports Phone was not just a hotline, it was a lifeline. And even to this day, that number is still etched into sports fans' minds as any player's jersey number. The funny thing is, Sports Phone came about thanks to Santa Claus. Back in 1964, the Macy's department store in New York introduced a Dial Santa line. It was a huge hit. It attracted 2 million calls in just a few weeks. But all those calls back then to the same number put a strain on New York Telephone's network and disrupted service. The ordeal prompted the phone company to develop a way for large numbers of callers to reach a single number simultaneously. 8 years and $10 million later, they finally perfected the technology. Launched in 1972 and then revamped in 1975, Sports Phone quickly became a New York City obsession. It averaged 65,000 calls a day by 1976, and by the early 80s, 50 million calls a year. It was like the original version of sports radio and Twitter rolled into one, scores and stories. But what really made Sports Phone legendary wasn't just the scores, but the voices behind the mic. Young broadcasters crammed into tiny booths, racing the clock to cram 30 scores into 57 seconds. And many of those voices went on to become household names. We're talking about guys like Michael Kay or Bob Papa or Gary Cohn, Al Troutwig, Brian Kilmeade, Howie Rose, Linda Cohn, Don LaGreca, Jack Curry, and a whole bunch more. Now, Sports Phone was fast. It was addictive and it was revolutionary. For a generation of sports fans and future broadcasters, It was everything. Although as a caller, you always had that conversation with your parents when the phone bill finally came. And now, thanks to a fantastic book titled 976-1313, How Sports Phone Launched Careers and Broke New Ground, this lost but certainly not forgotten piece of sports history is finally getting the spotlight it deserves. Joining me today is the co-author, Scott Orgera, to walk us through the origins of sports phone, its impact on the media landscape, the characters behind the scenes, and how it intersected with everything from mobster Henry Hill of Goodfellas to a teenage trivia whiz named Kenny Albert. Here's my conversation with Scott. All right, Scott, this book brought back so many memories, and I'm sure it will for readers as well. Can we start with the basics? What drew you to this subject, and why did you feel like Sports Phone deserved its own book?
So I've been 31 years now. I've been covering local sports here, mostly in New York, and I've spent a lot of time in press boxes with people that worked at Sports Phone. And over the years, I continued to hear story after story, and it was always fascinating that not only this thing existed, but that the people that work there, yourself included, which I'm sure we'll get to later, all went on to become household names in our business and in other areas in Hollywood. And it just, the stories themselves to me were fascinating, but also the fact that the majority of people that worked there went on to just have these great careers. So over the years, I always talked to Howie Carpenter, my co-author. Been friends with Howie for about 30 years now. He's the senior official scorer in New York City. And I spent a lot of long nights, Yankee Stadium, Shea, Citi Field, wherever, sitting next to Howie and talking to him about the Sports Phone days. And I always, would mention that there's got to be a book here because I don't know why it hasn't been written yet. And just the list of people that work there alone would be enough for a fascinating story. And as time went on, I started to put together an outline. And one day I approached Howie. I said, look, no one's done this yet still. And I don't know why. I won't do it without you. So if you're interested, let's give it a shot. If not, we'll just leave it there. And maybe one day someone will take it on. So Howie not only was he on board, but he mentioned that there were people over the years that, because Howie's written a bunch of books. So they say, well, why don't you do one on Sports Phone? You were there almost 10 years and just never got around to it. And there were other people that we interviewed that kind of said the same thing. Like Don LaGreca was like, I always wanted to do it. And there were other people always wanted to do it and just didn't get to it. So Howie and I took this on. And when we did, we didn't know it was going to be as big as it became as far as size. I mean, we're almost 500 pages and we could have gone 700. We had to cut out a bunch of stuff. And the reason for that is Sports Phone spanned multiple decades and it impacted so many people. So that's where it started. It grew as we started to interview people and do research, and it turned into something a lot bigger than we assumed it would be. But that's where it started. I just hearing the stories over the years in press boxes during rain delays and it was just one of those things where I couldn't believe that it hadn't been done yet. And I'm lucky and grateful that we were the ones that got to share the story.
It's funny because even when working there, like someone myself, your thought in your mind was, man, somebody should write a book about this place, but yet nobody had. Were you surprised that there was really no account on this subject? Because Sports Phone at its heyday, which was, a good 20 years or so, was a major part of sports fans' lives.
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked, to be honest with you. And as we started to do research, this is where it became a little difficult. There's not much out there. Like you mentioned, I mean, there are a few long-form articles. Neil Best had covered it for Newsday, 3 or 4 page article. There was something in The Ringer, Rolling Stone, but not a lot. You'd have these random articles here and there. And what made it a challenge, but it was also a lot of fun, is this isn't one of those subjects that you can just Google it and get the history. It really, other than the basics, it wasn't there. So we wound up interviewing over 100 people, and we did a ton of research in places that we didn't think we'd be heading, like the National Archives for the FBI. And maybe we'll get to that later. And, a lot of research went into it that obviously if you're going to write the book, you want to make sure that you get everything right. But also the fact that no one had done it before, Howie and I felt this responsibility to make sure that if we're going to do this, we have to get everything, the entire history, but we also want to make sure that we do it justice, because sports phone has such a large impact on what we have now in terms of media and how people get information, not only in sports, but in other areas that were influenced by sports phone. So we wanted to make sure that we did right by folks like yourself and anyone that worked there or were a part of it, because without sports phone, I don't think, I mean, maybe we get there eventually, but without sports phone, I don't think we get a lot of the, I guess, things that people have become accustomed to today in terms of just live updates and live scores and how we disseminate sports information. A lot of it started with sports phone.
Yeah, I mean, sports phone was very influential in this concept of the media landscape.
Definitely. I mean, at the time when sports phone first originated, I don't think the people that started it, I know for a fact, actually, that many of them didn't realize that it would have such an immediate impact, that the demand was so large for just instant score updates and instant sports news updates, because it didn't exist at the time. We take it for granted now, but there was a time where you had to wait until maybe a radio update or the 11 o'clock news or even the next day's newspaper to find out what happened in a game, or find out if a trade occurred, or really anything that had to do with the sports world in terms of news. But soon after sports phone launched, the call volumes were just crazy and out of control. And then they realized very quickly, wow, people have been wanting this for a long time, but I don't think they realized it. You had gamblers, obviously, they were a big part of the sports phone caller base, obviously calling 10, 15, 20 times a day. And this was something that they didn't have access to before. And it eventually became the ESPN bottom line, or sports radio, like WFEN in New York initially. And all these live instant updates and instant news, it just wasn't there before. When you try to explain it to people today, that are a little younger than us, first of all, they don't even know what a payphone is. But
right.
When you try to explain that you had to go through this process to just get a score, they kind of get the deer in the headlights look, and you have to really break it down for them, because they're used to everything being at their fingertips. So I think that without intending to be pioneers and without intending to launch this instant access, instant news landscape with sports, that's exactly what sports phone did. And even in the later years, I know you were there in the 90s, the team specific hotlines, for example, the sports phone live, which you were a big part of. These were things that were unheard of before. And now, you see it everywhere. I mean, you have team specific websites, team specific apps. And one thing that I found really surprising was when I talked to Lee Steinberg, the sports agent who was the real life Jerry Maguire. He was the influence for that character. He actually started two very successful companies off of what he learned and what he basically found out from calling sports phone, because he had all these, at one point he pretty much represented like half the NFL quarterbacks. And, back then you don't have red zone and you don't have all these other things. So he may be watching one game and he's calling sports phone all day to see what's going on with his other clients, because they expect you to know what's going on with them. If a quarterback gets hurt, he needs to know immediately so he can call him after the game and be aware of what happened. So he was calling sports phone all the time. And one of the things that came out of that was a website which offered team-specific content. That doesn't seem like a big deal now, but that didn't exist back then. And he said he owed it all to sports phone. So I think there are a lot of stories of people that may have gone on to innovate, just some new breakthroughs, whether it be how you deliver information, whether it be specific to certain sports fan bases. I'm sorry. I think a lot of that came from sports phone. And Lee gives sports phone credit. There are other people that may not actually mention sports phone, but it's quite obvious when you look at what they've done, they got the idea from sports phone.
Yeah, you started, when you think about a book about sports phone, obviously you talk to the people that work there or people that call, but you reached out to so many people that you would not think would be who would know what sports phone even was. You mentioned Lee Steinberg. Who were some of the other surprising names that gave you time to talk about this project?
So one that surprised me a lot, and I'm a big Curb Your Enthusiasm fan, and Jeff Garlin, who played Jeff Green on the show, he was a big sports guy, still is, Chicago native. And at the time, sports phone was really booming in the 80s. He's on the road a lot. He was a new comedian and he couldn't keep up with the Cubs and the Bears. So he's calling sports phone all the time. And he was saying that sports phone was his best friend. He without it, he wouldn't know what to do. And that was one that surprised me only because, you don't think of, these big names, how important sports phone was to their life. And the thing that was really cool, which we didn't expect when we first started, phone programs, which was Sports Phone's parent company initially, they had all these other hotlines too that were very successful, and some of them were tied to specific musicians and like Will Smith, Fresh Prince. I spoke to Jazzy Jeff, who's his DJ, who was a big part of their hotline, and they brought in like $10 million the first year of their hotline. And again, that was out of the same office and the same company as Sports Phone, so there was a lot of crossover in terms of them promoting each other and some of the folks, actually meeting each other and hanging out. And when I spoke to him, he said for them, their hotline pretty much launched their career, and it was the first big thing that they had kind of done. And there were other stories like that with a lot of the wrestlers. You name a big wrestling name in the 70s or the 80s, there's a very good chance that they were in the sports phone offices recording promos at one time or another. So it was this whole surreal picture of all these different worlds and sports and entertainment, all coming together to create these hotlines. And, it was something that didn't exist before, and people just couldn't get enough of it. They're calling multiple times a day. So being able to talk to people like that, and then also those within the sports world that utilize sports phone in ways that I didn't expect. For example, Chris Russo, Mad Dog, he was saying that when he was in Florida, he had a show down there, and then eventually with Mike and the Mad Dog, he said he would call sports phone all the time because it was quicker to get updates from sports phone than it was from the wire or other methods that were available at the time. So, and I know Ed Engels, I think was a professor of yours.
Yep, absolutely.
And Ed obviously doesn't need any introduction. Anyone that knows sports media or media in general knows the name. There was a time where he'd have interns call sports phone to get updates because, again, quicker than the wire. And there were a lot of broadcasters that gave us similar stories. That surprised me only because I just didn't expect that. I mean, people are calling for gambling reasons or as a fan, but when you hear stories like that, it was pretty wild. And then Susan Wellman, obviously everyone knows if you're a Yankee fan, she's been on the radio covering the Yankees for a long time. She was a Broadway star at one point before she even got into the sports world. And Susan was in a play. I don't have the name in front of me. I apologize, but she was in a play on Broadway, and the Celtics, she's from Boston, big Celtics fan. The Celtics were in the playoffs. And during the play, not a rehearsal or a walkthrough, this is actual play with a live audience. She's whispering in this little kid's ear who's in the play as well, a 10-year-old kid, to go downstairs under the stage. There was a payphone and call to get score updates for the Celtics games. And then when they had a scene together, the kid would walk up and whisper the score in her ear. Audience had no idea this is going on, but it just shows you what sports phone meant to so many people in so many different walks of life. I wasn't expecting any of that, and neither was Howie. Our thing was to cover the people that worked there and the history, but we wound up getting so many great stories from callers that they couldn't do without sports phone. It was just a very big part of their lives.
Yeah, you mentioned that the owners didn't realize how big it was going to be. Did they realize the technological advantages they had over the print media, especially when it came to breaking news, or was that just kind of like a happy accident?
That was a happy accident. But once it happened, they took full advantage of it. And they started to make sure that, especially locally, that they had stringers in place at different events, whether it be the baseball strike. There's a story in the book where the Celtics owner at the time, this is the Bob McAdoo trade, which was pretty big at the time. He walks into the bar downstairs from the sports phone offices, which is 919 3rd Avenue in Midtown at the time. And he's just a midwinter night after the Knicks played the Celtics at the Garden. He comes in and maybe he's had one too many drinks, so he's talking very loosely to the bartender who he knows. We just traded for the championship tonight, and one of the sports phone announcers happens to be sitting at the bar. His shift's over. It's late. And he starts asking some questions, not prying, but he did get enough information from the owner to learn that Bob McAdoo was traded. Not only that, that the two owners sketched out the trade on a napkin in one of the suites at MSG, which is a really old school way of doing things. So he goes back upstairs. The office was closed for the night, and he puts a new recording on and says Sports Phone has learned that, that Bob McAdoo has been traded to Boston. So the next time this particular Sports Phone reporter was at MSG covering a game, one of the beat writers from the New York Times, kind of got in his face, like, how did you get that? Because back then the beat writers got everything first, and that's just the way it worked. And they ran their early story, and that's it. So now someone who basically at that time was not, and I don't mean the individual that covered it, I mean Sports Phone in general was not very respected as a legitimate media outlet by some of the newspaper guys. They began to see that not only the Sports Phone have this advantage on us, but that the folks working there are actually legitimate reporters. They're doing the work. They're in the locker room. They're cultivating sources. They're not just some guys working for this little outfit that is serving gamblers. They're there for another purpose. They're actually journalists, and they're breaking news. So once that became clear that they had that advantage, they started to cover the winter meetings, and they started to cover different events, and they were breaking news instantly, which back then you couldn't do that. I mean, no one really had that advantage that they did. Of course, you had radio, but you didn't have sports radio yet. So, the Sports Phone broke a lot of big stories. A lot of people we spoke to learned that the Mets had traded Tom Seaver via Sports Phone. And, some of them said that it was one of the worst phone calls they ever made in their life. So, yeah, I mean, that was pretty much a happy accident, but it was one that definitely helped them establish themselves as legitimate journalists and a legitimate outfit for news.
One of the big parts of the book, of course, has the connection to the movie Goodfellas and Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke and the points shaving scandal. I think it was in 81. Can you just kind of detail how you found that out? Because I don't think anybody had ever made that connection before. And what was that moment like when you realized, hey, wait a second, they're talking about Sports Phone?
So speaking of happy accidents, and, I've been lucky enough to be in sports media for a long time, but this was a moment that probably trumps anything I've ever been involved in, only because of the way it played out. So like I mentioned before, there wasn't much out there about Sports Phone. So we're digging through newspaper archives for any little tidbits we can find. So one day, I found a dispatch from a Brooklyn federal court in 1981, and it was basically just a summary of what happened in court that day. Jimmy Burke, who was Robert De Niro in the movie, obviously, he was on trial he was on trial multiple times for a number of things. I mean, as if you've seen the movie, you know this, he was pretty much a cold-blooded killer, but these guys were heavily involved in gambling. So one of the pieces of evidence that was entered that day and into the BC point shaving trial was a list of phone numbers. And it didn't say what each phone number was. It didn't say the purpose of why the prosecution had entered it. It was sort of a throwaway paragraph at the end of the article. And one of the numbers was 9761313. And I'm looking at it and I said, this has to be a mistake. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm trying to figure this out for weeks. I'm digging and I can't figure out. I'm calling different courthouses. I'm trying to get records. So finally, I take a shot. The prosecutor of that case was Ed McDonald, who actually wound up playing himself in Goodfellas in one of the most famous scenes towards the end of the movie, where he's trying to get Henry Hill and his wife to go into witness protection. And I said, let me reach out to Ed, because if this is a mistake, he'll know. And nicest guy in the world. We spoke for 2 hours the first time, hour and a half the second time, and turns out that it was sports phone. And the reason it was there is these guys, Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, some of the other guys involved in the case, they were degenerate gamblers. And they were also obviously involved in fixing games up at Boston College. So they were calling sports phone all the time. So I started to get a lot of background. And as I'm talking to Ed, and I eventually talked to another Ed Guevara, who was the FBI agent who arrested Hill, I start getting more information. And what's really cool about this to me, I was always a big Goodfellas fan, is I'm hearing things from them that was not in the movie, was not in the book, was not in the 30 for 30 about BC. So it's like, oh, well, we might have some unique stuff here, but I didn't want to stretch it and force things in the book that really weren't sports phone related. But a lot of what they talked about had to do with the gambling aspect of it. And then where we really hit pay dirt was one day I was ready to give up. And I found my way to National Archives in Kansas City, Missouri. The way the building was described to me, it was just a warehouse full of boxes of printouts from court cases long gone that no one will ever look at. And I spoke to an archivist and I said, is there any chance that you could find the printouts from this court case for me? Because back then it wasn't digitally stored. So they, Brooklyn Federal Court, they were very nice to me, but they couldn't find it. It wasn't on the computer. So within a half hour, this guy gets back to me. He's like, well, I can scan the court for you, the court documents, all of them. The phone records, everything. I was like, yeah, if you wouldn't mind. And then, we didn't have a budget, Howie and I, doing this, by the way. So I'm thinking this is going to be very expensive and take a year. So I was like, well, how much would it cost if we can do that? He goes, oh, about $8. So I'm like, I said, please do. Within another hour or two, I'm sitting here printing out all these court case files. And in there are phone records, Jimmy Burke's house and all this other stuff. And it's showing calls back and forth between them. And then multiple calls to sports phone. So my next step was to talk to someone with the FBI to say, is it okay if we reprint this in the book? And they were totally fine with it. So then I regrouped with Ed McDonald again. I got some more information about the sports phone tie, and it wound up being a full chapter in the book. And as someone that was such a big fan of the movie, that blew me away because I pretty much stumbled upon it. And you know how it goes. Once you start pulling on a thread, you don't know where it's going to lead. And that was one of those stories. So, excuse me. And there was no byline. So whoever that Brooklyn court reporter was back in 81 that filed that dispatch, wherever you are, thank you, because it it led us to some really cool stuff.
Yeah. And let me start that again. Sorry. And Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke, not the only big names, is another big focus of the book of all the young broadcasters who would go on to become household names for sports fans. The Steve Torreys, the Bob Papas, the Howie Roses, the Don LaGreccas, Steve Cangelosi, Brian Kilmeade from Fox News. How giving were those people of their time and the influence that sports phone had on them?
So Howie and I, being in sports, we were lucky enough to know a lot of these people ahead of time, which I think may have helped a little bit. But once they started, I would book an interview and say, you only need 15 or 20 minutes of your time. But once they start reminiscing and telling these stories, they couldn't stop. I mean, for them, I think it was a treat because these were the beginnings of everyone's career. And these were some very great, funny stories. Some of them not so funny. There were some really dark stories in there as well. But these were, everyone likes to reminisce on the beginning and how they started for the most part. So I wound up talking to some people for an hour and a half, 2 hours that we planned to talk for 20 minutes because they just loved telling stories from those days. And I think that, some of it has to do with all of us like to look back when we were younger, but I think it's more than that. I think the camaraderie and just being a part of it, it was something that, when they look back on it, I think a lot of people realize, and I know you had mentioned this as well when we spoke, that at the time you don't really know that you're in something big, or you don't realize that you're setting the tone for your career. But when you look back on it, you realize how much you learned and how much you grew from that experience. So the short answer is that everyone was very giving, and we didn't really come across anyone that didn't want to talk about it for the most part. So it helped us out a lot for sure.
And then, of course, you also have in the book, the forward was written by Kenny Albert, who, pound for pound, best sports play-by-play guy, can call any sport. What was how did you go about getting him to make that connection to write the forward?
So, and it was an honor to even share a cover with Kenny, because I'm with you. I mean, this guy can cover anything at any time, and he's the best as far as I'm concerned as well. So Kenny, who Howie had a friendship with, which helped because Howie was well aware that Kenny, as a kid, and this really, other than being, obviously Marv's son, big sports fan, couldn't get enough of it. And as a kid, there was a thing called the Quickie Quiz on Sports Phone, which was initially created just to fill dead time, because Sports Phone was a 24-hour operation. And, you have certain times of the day where there's not any new scores or news to report upon. So the Quickie Quiz, basically, you'd answer a few questions. If you're the first one to answer them all right, you could win prizes, tickets to games, whatever. But the key was that you got your name mentioned on the air, quote unquote, on the air, over the phone. And that was a big deal for a lot of people. Kenny, this is, when I say as a kid, this is grade school years. He'd run home from school, surround himself with media guides, which I think was a benefit of having Marv as a dad. And he would just wait for the Quickie Quiz. And he was so fast and he was so knowledgeable that he was beating most adults that would call in that were, very adept and knew their sports. Kenny was winning a lot. So it was really cool for him, but it was also really cool for the people working at Sports Phone. Like, this is Marv's kid. He's a little kid, and he's beating everyone, and he's just this really, really great Quickie Quiz player. So, and he went on, obviously, to continue calling Sports Phone as a high schooler when he became even bigger fan of certain teams. He called during the NFL draft, and he gave us some stories there. So when Howie approached Kenny to write the forward, he jumped at it because he had such fond memories of Sports Phone and what it meant to him as a kid, and even as he got older before he broke into the business. So that was really cool. I mean, if you think about, obviously you mentioned the list of the people that worked there, so many big names, and we probably, I'm sure any of them would have been happy to write the forward, but to have someone maybe that didn't work there, but experienced from a completely different perspective, as a kid, but someone that actually went on to join the business anyway, we thought it was a really cool way to kick things off. And he did a nice job with the forward. It was special.
It's funny because as a person who was growing up at that time and a huge sports fan, even before I worked at Sports Phone, I just associated it with diehard fans. It took me maybe a couple of weeks of working there to realize the impact that the real audience were a lot of gamblers, the diehard, hardcore gamblers. And that was a big part of, and it completely changed. I didn't realize that going in, but that was a big part of it. And when we had the Sports Phone Live, which was like a party line of 30 voices, all shouting for whatever score they wanted, it was kind of like a battle royale to just try to get information out, which as the technology improved, the impact that Sports Phone had became clearer and clearer.
Absolutely. And I think the way you described it, that was one of my favorite quotes in the book about the guy with the balancing the spinning plates.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was like something from an old TV talk show where you're trying to spin plates on sticks, and every time you get one started, you got to go back to the first one and keep that one going as well.
Yeah, and you guys managed to do it. I mean, I know the Sports Phone Live, just the concept of it, when I think about it now, people shouting over each other to get their scores, and it's wild to me. But that became extremely popular. And, as time went on and the internet came along and more people started to get in their homes, and obviously you had sports radio at that point, the reason I think that Sports Phone was able to hang around until 2000, which is remarkable in its own way, is because of things like Sports Phone Live and the fact that we're able to keep creating new ways and new reasons for people to call in. And then you also had a lot of people that we talked to that just got accustomed to calling in. So even though they could maybe jump on the computer or turn on a game and wait for the bottom line to show their score, they still called because that's the way they always got their scores, and they just felt comfortable doing it. So as all these new technologies came along, Sports Phone still hung in there longer than I think a lot of people would have expected them to.
Now that you spent all this time researching and writing the book, what do you think the legacy of Sports Phone is?
I think it's a tough question because there's so much there. I would say that anyone that does not acknowledge the fact that Sports Phone pretty much pioneered a large majority of what you see now in sports media in terms of how information is disseminated, I think they're lying to themselves. I think that it's not an exaggeration to say that Sports Phone's legacy is that they basically had an untapped market that no one realized was there, and they did a lot on the fly and pretty much hit it out of the park because eventually they became this established journalism entity that was received a billion calls by the year 1990. So I think and there's also the other legacy though. The fact that I'd say it's not an exaggeration as well that 85-90% of the people that came out of Sports Phone that worked there, which I've never heard of this in any startup in any industry, they all went on to become successful in whatever industry they chose. You don't see that. And that, I think that has something to do with the fact that everyone was very hungry and they took the job seriously. And everyone, in a lot of ways, and in a positive way, tried to outdo one another. You know how it is with, especially in media. You want to be the best at what you're doing. And I think that environment kind of fostered that. So, yeah, I think the legacy is twofold in the sense that you have this large group of people that went on to become successful that started there. And you also have all these technologies and methods of giving out information that really started with Sports Phone.
Would you ever want to see a documentary made about the book?
I would. And it's funny because a lot of people have been talking to us about it. There's a lot of interest out there. From what I've been told is that things move a little slow in that world when it comes to film. We've had a lot of interest, which is a good thing, but I guess we need to practice some patience. Peter Newman, who's one of the original Sports Phone crew, Peter went on to produce 30-something movies. He's worked with everyone in Hollywood. The Jeff Daniels, Keitel, Michael J. Fox. The list, Gary Oldman. It's a crazy list. But Peter, who now heads up the NYU Film School, he's been a great resource for us because he's kind of helped us navigate through that world and who we should talk to, et cetera. And also Jeff Louini, who's the executive producer of Always Sunny in Philadelphia. He's been a great guy to lean on. He loves the book. He's actually pitched it himself to some big places. So, we're hopeful. One other thing which I did not expect is, in addition to a documentary, a lot of these folks have recommended that it should also be a fiction-based series. Something along the lines of, I believe it was Peter, I don't want to attribute the wrong quote to the wrong person, but mentioned something about a mix between, a newsroom documentary combined with a comedy. The key here is no matter what this ends up becoming, if it becomes anything in terms of something on the screen, you don't have to embellish it. You don't have to make anything up. The characters are there. The stories are there. And not too often does something come along where you don't have to. Everything gets embellished for Hollywood. But in this case, I really don't think you have to do it. The characters themselves are, probably don't have time to go through them, but there are some really interesting people and, some crazy stories that came out of those offices, whether it was at 919 3rd Avenue or Elmont, where you guys were, or in the later years in New Jersey and Franklin Lakes. It was almost like a newsroom and a frat house at the same time in some of the stories. And it's just, to me, and, I'm saying this objectively, not as the co-author of the book, and I mean that. I think that it's just tailor-made for something to watch. I believe it is. So hopefully we get there eventually. And I don't know. I think it's a story that everyone would be very interested in, even if you're not a sports fan, because there's just so much there. There's so many layers.
Scott, finally, where can people find the book?
Pretty much anywhere. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever else you get your books. We also have an audio version of the book, which you can get that on Audible, on Spotify. That's pretty much everywhere as well, where you can get audiobooks. And You could also go to 9761313.com for more information. And if you want a personalized signed copy for me and Howie, you can get that there. And, if anyone listens to this, if you remember Sports Phone, or even if you don't, I think if you have any interest in that world, whether it be sports, media, or entertainment, there's something in there for everyone.
Marketing for a sports team? Can't quite think of a way to engage loyal fans as much as you would like? This is where a .vote web address comes in. Allow for fans to help decide player of the game, player of the week, or MVP of a season. There are hundreds of ways you can conduct polls for fan engagement that benefits both the organization and the fan base. Visit www.godaddy.com and purchase www.yourteam.vote.
So a huge thanks to Scott Orgera for joining the podcast and sharing the incredible history behind 976-1313, the rise and fall of Sports Phone. It's amazing to think how one number kind of changed the way we consume sports, and also in the process gave a lot of legendary broadcasters their first start in the business. So if you're a sports fan, a radio junkie, someone who loves a good behind-the-scenes story, I highly recommend picking up the book. Again, the title is 976-1313, How Sports Phone Launched Careers and Broke New Ground. It's by Scott Orgera and Howie Carpin. And I highly recommend picking it up because it's a reminder, before everything became instant, getting your sports fix used to take some real effort and sometimes a few quarters. So thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please make sure you hit subscribe, leave a review, share it with someone who might be old enough to remember the time before the internet existed. And I'll be back next time right here on Gordon Damer on Sports.